Okay, so I did just want to do one more hot take on mechanics. I'm probably doing too many of these, but if you like them, you like them. So I want to do one about like grid inventories. I think like the grid inventory, in contrast to I just recorded the dialogue system one. In contrast to like a dialogue system or more in similarity to a minigame, I think the grid inventory doesn't really add anything to a game. And I've heard some people make some mentions about how it's kind of like more immersive or how it allows you to do, certain different things. But I really do think that it's not as necessary as people think. I really do think you can mostly get away with sort of the Fallout 3 style of inventory, which is literally just a list and weights on items. And that sounds kind of strange. Like when you really think about it, what grid inventory does is just limits the amount of things you can carry, and having a carry weight will do the same thing. There's also an element too of like when you pull up a grid inventory, people like spend all this time trying to organize it, trying to get it to work. I feel like that's just another example of pulling the player out of the game. They're now playing this game of Tetris instead of playing, this other game that they're thinking about. And I can see that there is a bit of an element of like the player sort of preparing for an encounter or preparing for a situation, but I just don't believe it's that necessary. And you can still prepare for a situation by having a list inventory. I've heard people say too, like bags or like specific slots in your inventory can be either in a more immersive or like a balancing thing or like just have like a few different reasons for doing that. But you can just limit a bag or an inventory space on weight. There's like no reason why you can't do that. And you may end up with a few unrealistic or slightly unrealistic weights on things, but it still is just a much cleaner, much faster way to implement essentially the same restrictions on the player without having to try to manage whatever a grid inventory is and just that technology overhead. It probably also sounds kind of strange too, so I'm talking about all these mechanics that I think people shouldn't include or things that they shouldn't have or what you shouldn't do. I know that in some ways that's kind of against the spirit of designing video games because you want to, try new things and build new things. But for me, I see it more as the most efficient way I can get depth out of a game. And also like the most economic way that I can work. In the sense that time is my greatest commodity. And this probably comes from, my experience doing a lot of game jams and mostly working solo, where essentially every time I'm working on something, I'm not working on something else. And so I have to be kind of dogmatic about finding mechanics or finding ways to do the same thing as something else, but not necessarily do it in the way that is the easiest to implement or the most straightforward way of sort of building it, but to think and be like, hey, how do I take a simple implementation of a mechanic and get the most out of it, as opposed to building the most like AAA version of that mechanic, which I see a lot of people tending to go in that direction. And that's kind of what I feel like the grid inventory is. I feel like it is a very like AAA solution to having an inventory. There's a lot of games too that, don't do that and seem to do really well. An example of that would be Elden Ring or any of the Souls games. They use, the list inventory type system. I mean, there is equipping, but it's still kind of the same thing. And then you also have, I also mentioned, like Fallout for doing this. A lot of RPGs tend to go kind of either way on this. Some will do a grid inventory, but every grid location is just like it's essentially a list in a grid format where you just have like each space is its own icon kind of thing. That might even be the worst of both worlds because now you're not using sort of the cool aspects of a grid, and it probably takes longer to implement. But I think from a screen real estate standpoint, there might be something there with the list inventory. I think you can just get it all in there, and you can also like display some more information about stuff. I just think it's a much cleaner way of doing it. But I was gonna say I think I was gonna try to see if I could find a way in my head to like justify having a grid inventory. And really like the only way I can see to do it is like because you can assign it to someone else to do it. I just don't think that's a great idea. I feel like it's probably the best example of a feature that people always say they want, but if you didn't include it, people would not notice. what makes me wonder is like how many hours are devs, either professional or indie, how many hours are they spending building, debugging, maintaining their grid inventories when they could have just made a list and taken that time and just put it into something else. Anyway, I think I've gone a little bit overboard on this. So I'll just say before you do a grid inventory, do a list inventory. You kind of have to do all the same stuff anyway. Start there, and then only if you really need to go to the grid, because I don't think there's a reason. And you know what? I'll say it. I hope that like 20 Tomcasts from now, I'm coming out here and I'm like, hey, I was wrong about grid inventory, but I really don't think that's going to happen.